What if a single storm could change the rest of your life? Graham Whitaker was a man who had everything: wealth, success, and a corner office in Boston's tallest tower. But he also carried a silent torment, years of sleepless nights, haunted by memories he never spoke aloud. For a man who thrived on control, rest was the one thing he could never buy. Claire Bennett was nothing more than his efficient secretary, or so she thought. A woman from the rocky coast of Maine. She knew storms, and she knew how to keep going when the world turned rough. But she never imagined she would become the only person who could bring peace to a man who had forgotten how to close his eyes. One nor'easter, one small inn, one bed left to share. From that night forward, nothing would be the same. But here is the question: can love born in chance survive in a world of boardrooms, betrayals, and whispered rumors? Or will the storm that brought them together also tear them apart? Stay with us, like this video, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe to Shining Stories. Because this is more than a romance, it's a journey through storms toward peace. The nor'easter came without mercy. By late afternoon, the wind had turned the harbor into a churning gray cauldron. Ferries were canceled, roads closed, and the small town of Harbor Point, Maine, was cut off as if the world beyond had vanished. Snow blew sideways, sharp as glass, and the air tasted of salt and cold iron. Harbor Point Inn, a clapboard house trimmed in blue shutters, stood as the only refuge. Its chimney puffed steadily, and the warm glow of lamps spilled across the drifts outside. Travelers who had planned to pass through now crowded its foyer, stamping boots, shaking off coats, and begging for rooms. Graham Whitaker, tall in his dark overcoat, stood stiffly by the counter. His phone showed a dozen missed calls from Boston, his company's headquarters. He could manage a billion-dollar merger, but not a storm. He hated delays, disruptions, anything beyond his control. Worst of all, he dreaded the night ahead. For years, sleep had been his enemy. Insomnia kept him pacing penthouse floors while the rest of the world rested. Beside him, Claire Bennett tightened her scarf. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and strands of brown hair escaped her bun. She had handled his schedule for 3 years, knew his sharp temper in meetings, knew the stack of prescriptions he never used. She had not expected to be stranded with him in her hometown of all places. Mrs. Doyle, the innkeeper with silver hair and kind eyes, spread her hands apologetically. "I'm sorry, dears. Every room is taken, except one." Graham's jaw tightened. "We'll take it. It's a queen bed," she added gently. "I hope that's no trouble." Claire looked up, startled. Sharing a bed with her boss was unthinkable. Yet the storm howled so fiercely outside that refusing meant freezing in the lobby. She gave a small nod, more to herself than to anyone else. The room was simple. Floral curtains framed the window, and an old radiator clanked and hissed. A quilt, hand-stitched in fading blues and greens, covered the bed. On the dresser stood a small plate with 2 slices of apple pie. The smell of cinnamon softened the sharpness of the storm. Graham set his briefcase down like it was an anchor. "I'll take the left side." "Fine," Claire replied, placing a pillow lengthwise down the middle, boundary. He almost smiled, but the weight in his chest kept it from reaching his eyes. He removed his tie, unbuttoned his shirt collar, and sat stiffly on the edge of the bed. She slipped into flannel pajamas patterned with tiny stars, folded her sweater on the chair, and climbed onto her side. For a while, silence filled the room, broken only by the moan of the wind and the rattle of branches against the siding. Graham lay on his back, eyes wide open, listening to the storm. Sleep never came easy, not in hotel suites, not in his penthouse, not anywhere. He turned, adjusted the pillow, closed his eyes, still nothing. Then he noticed her breathing, steady, soft, like the tide pulling gently against sand. The faint scent of vanilla from her shampoo lingered in the air. He shifted slightly, not to cross the pillow barrier, but closer to the sound of her presence. His chest eased, the knots in his shoulders loosened. For the first time in years, his mind quieted, And without meaning to, he drifted. He dreamed of nothing at all, only blackness, deep and healing. When dawn came, pale light spilling through lace curtains, Graham woke slowly. The storm had passed, leaving the world hushed under white drifts. He lay still, disoriented. His body felt heavier, yet lighter. Rested. His watch said he had slept 7 straight hours. Impossible. He turned his head. Claire was curled on her side, her hair loose across the pillow. She stirred, blinked, then sat up suddenly. "Oh no," she whispered. We slept." He finished. His voice was softer than usual, almost reverent. A knock came at the door. "Mrs." Doyle called cheerfully. "Breakfast is ready." "Sweethearts?" Claire's eyes widened. "Sweethearts." Voices drifted from the hallway. Other guests whispering, chuckling. Rumors already bloomed like frost on glass. By the time they reached the dining room, locals on Facebook were posting about the mysterious Boston man and the girl who once lived down the street. Claire kept her gaze on her oatmeal, cheeks red. Graham ate quietly, but inside his thoughts were racing. He had slept, deep, unbroken sleep, not from medicine, not from exhaustion, from the simple closeness of another human breath. As they packed to leave, Claire pulled her coat tight. "Let's just forget this happened." "Of course," Graham said. His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed something else. They stepped out into the bright morning. The inn sign creaked above them, snow glittered across the harbor, and the world looked deceptively ordinary. Yet neither of them felt quite the same. They told themselves it was a passing accident, a night swallowed by a storm. But some nights are never just accidents. The smell of bacon drifted down the narrow hallway of Harbor Point Inn. Coffee percolated, and dishes clattered softly in the dining room. Guests gathered in clusters, voices rising and falling like the tide. What should have been an ordinary New England breakfast felt more like a town meeting, with Graham and Claire as the main agenda. Claire hesitated at the doorway, clutching her gloves. Her stomach knotted. She could already feel eyes turning. A hush spread across the room, brief but sharp, before conversation resumed in deliberate whispers. She forced herself to step in, her boots clicking softly on the wood floor. Graham followed, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. He looked like a man walking into a boardroom where rumors had already poisoned the deal. His dark coat was perfectly pressed, hair in place, every movement measured, yet no amount of polish could erase the faint blush that touched his jaw. They sat at a small table near the window. Outside, snow glistened, the harbor still hidden under mist. Inside, every fork scraping against china seemed to echo. Claire lowered her gaze to the oatmeal placed before her. She stirred slowly, though she wasn't hungry. Across the room, a young mother leaned toward her friend. "They say they only had one room left," she murmured, not quite low enough. "Mm-hmm," the friend replied, smirking. "That's what they all say." Claire's cheeks burned. She wished she had a shield, something thicker than her coffee mug. She dared not look up, afraid of meeting another pair of curious eyes. Graham, on the other hand, lifted his fork calmly. He ate with steady precision, as if the whispers were nothing but background noise. He had mastered the art of ignoring speculation in business. Shareholders often spun worse. But here, the chatter felt different, more intimate. It tugged at something unprotected in him. Claire noticed his stillness between bites. "You don't have to sit through this," she said softly, though her voice trembled. He didn't look at her. Running away only confirms what they're already thinking. Her eyes widened. "You care what they think." He paused, fork midair. "I care about control." The words dropped between them like stones. She turned back to her oatmeal, trying to hide the sting. For her, control had never been an option. Life in a small town meant gossip was part of the air one breathed. What mattered was how one met it with humor, with grace, or with fire. An older couple at the next table leaned in. The woman, gray hair neatly pinned, whispered a little too loudly. That poor girl, caught up with a man like him. Though, maybe it's for the best. He looks like he hasn't slept in years." Claire wanted to vanish. She folded her napkin, fingers trembling, but then another voice rose. Mrs. Doyle, bustling between tables with a pot of coffee, laughed warmly. "Now, don't be cruel. Sometimes the Lord works in strange ways. Maybe sharing a bed cured him better than any pill." The room chuckled, cups clinked, Graham froze, for one breath, then two. He did not move. Her words pierced deeper than the whispers, deeper than the rumors. Could it be true? Could a night of steady breathing beside another person undo years of sleepless torment? Claire glanced at him. His fork rested untouched, his hand suspended above the table. For once, the shield slipped. She saw not the CEO who commanded rooms, but a man startled by hope. She swallowed. "You did sleep, didn't you?" He didn't answer, not with words. His eyes flicked to hers, dark with something she could not name, then back to his plate. The dining room buzzed on. Children asked for more syrup, chairs scraped, yet between them, silence thickened. Claire tried to fill it. People will forget by noon. They always do. But even she knew that wasn't true. In Harbor Point, stories lingered like sea fog. They rolled through Facebook groups, were retold at the post office, embellished at the bakery. By sundown, half the town would have a version of last night that included candlelight and vows. She sipped her coffee, willing her hands not to shake. Graham finished his eggs with deliberate calm. To anyone watching, he was unfazed. Only Claire noticed the way his shoulders held a fraction too much tension, the way he blinked more slowly, as if fighting thoughts he didn't want revealed. After breakfast, they thanked Mrs. Doyle, collected their coats, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, bright, unforgiving. Snow squeaked underfoot as they walked toward the car. Neither spoke. The storm had passed, but something else had settled between them. Claire tucked her chin into her scarf, eyes on the road ahead. "We'll laugh about this someday," she murmured, half to herself. Graham didn't laugh. He slipped on his gloves, jaw set. Yet his mind circled the words he could not dismiss. Maybe sharing a bed had done what medicine could not. Maybe the cure he had spent years searching for was as simple as another person's presence. The thought unsettled him, and for the first time in a long time, he feared not the storm outside, but the storm inside. The car door closed with a dull thud. The engine turned. They drove out of town, leaving Harbor Point Inn behind, its windows glowing warmly against the snow. But the whispers remained, following them like shadows. Neither admitted it, but both knew the story was far from over. Boston was bright and brittle in late February. Snow crusted along the edges of sidewalks, steam rising from grates in the financial district. Graham Whitaker returned to headquarters with his usual air of command. Yet those closest to him noticed the faintest change. His steps were less clipped. The circles under his eyes, though not gone, had softened. He had slept once, and the memory clung to him like a secret he refused to admit. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished oak and strong coffee. The executive council had gathered, faces sharp with concern. These were men and women who lived by quarterly reports and forecasts. But today their agenda was personal. Graham's health had become impossible to ignore. "Mr. Whitaker," one of the directors began, "we've consulted with your physician. The recommendation is clear. If we expect you to lead effectively, we must address your insomnia. It is not optional anymore." Graham bristled. He hated the word must. His jaw flexed, eyes narrowing. "I manage." "You don't," another replied gently. "We've all seen it. The fatigue in meetings, the restless pacing. Your mind is sharp, but your body is burning out." Silence pressed on the room until the door opened. Dr. Harris, his longtime physician, entered with a folder tucked under his arm. He was calm, clinical, yet firm. He set the folder down, opened it, and began to outline what he called a rest protocol. "First," he said, "a fixed bedtime, 10:30, no exceptions. Your body must relearn rhythm. Second, Breathing techniques, slow inhalations, measured exhalations. They sound simple, but they calm the nervous system. Third, no screens after 9. Light disrupts melatonin. Fourth, and this is crucial, a buddy system. Someone must hold you accountable. You've tried on your own for years. Graham, you need another presence. The words stung. Graham leaned back in his chair, face a mask of disbelief. You expect me to have a babysitter? No. Doctor, Harris replied evenly. An ally, someone who will ensure you follow the plan. Without that, the rest is meaningless. The board exchanged glances. Then Victor, his cousin and CFO, spoke with deliberate weight. We've discussed options. Claire Bennett already manages your schedule. She knows your patterns, your resistance. She is steady. She will oversee this protocol. The room fell silent. Claire, seated 2 chairs away, blinked. She had come prepared to record minutes, not to be assigned as guardian of her employer's sleep. Graham turned his gaze on her, sharp as steel. Absolutely not. Her hands tightened in her lap, but her voice remained steady. It isn't my choice. It's what they believe necessary. His lips thinned. This is an invasion. She held his stare. This is survival. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Graham's pride battled the logic pressing against him. He wanted to refuse, to slam the folder shut, to remind them all who built this empire. But the memory of Harbor Point Inn, the rare gift of 7 uninterrupted hours, whispered against his defenses. Claire broke the silence. If I'm to do this, there will be rules. Clear rules. We follow the protocol as written. You commit without argument. No late-night calls. No slipping back to your office after midnight. You treat rest as seriously as you treat profit. Her voice was calm, but inside her pulse hammered. She had never spoken to him like this. She expected him to snap, to dismiss her with a wave. Instead, he sat very still, his hands folded, his gaze unreadable. Finally, with the slowest of nods, he said, "Agreed, for now." The council exhaled, tension easing, notes were scribbled, decisions finalized. The meeting shifted back to numbers and contracts. But for Graham, the world had tilted. He had lost the power to dictate even his nights. Later, in his office overlooking the frozen Charles River, he found Claire pinning a fresh calendar to the wall. Each square was filled with neat handwriting, meetings, deadlines, travel, and now, written in red ink, bold and unmistakable, every night at the same line, 10:30 p.m. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed. So it's official. She turned, meeting his eyes without flinching. It is. Do you enjoy this sudden authority? She shook her head. Enjoy isn't the word. Necessary is. The clock on his desk ticked softly. The city hummed far below. Graham felt the familiar urge to resist, to wrest control back into his hands. Yet another part of him, the weary part, wondered what surrender might feel like. Claire capped her pen, straightened the calendar, and stepped back. You asked me once why I stay in this job. It isn't for power. It's because I believe even the strongest leaders need someone to remind them they're human. That's all I'm doing. He said nothing. Not yet. But when she left the office, the red 1030 glared back at him, steady as a lighthouse beam. For the first time, his nights no longer belonged to him alone. The city of Boston glittered outside Graham's penthouse windows. From 40 stories up, the lights spread like constellations across the frozen river and the dark neighborhoods beyond. He stood before the glass wall, phone in hand, scrolling through messages that had piled up after the board meeting, contracts, forecasts, questions waiting for his answers. This was the rhythm of his life, never stopping, never yielding. Behind him, Claire set a tray on the side table. The steam of chamomile tea curled into the air, carrying the faint scent of flowers. She moved with quiet purpose, arranging each item as if the ritual itself had weight. The tea, a small dish of almonds, the white noise machine already humming low with the sound of waves. "It's 10:15, she said. Her tone was gentle, but it left no room for debate. Graham barely glanced up. "There's work to finish. There will always be work," she replied, folding her arms. "But tonight, you stop at 10:30. That was the agreement." He exhaled sharply through his nose. Agreements, contracts those he understood. But surrendering control of his own nights felt foreign, almost humiliating. Yet he could not deny the quiet exhaustion pressing behind his eyes. He looked at her, saw the steadiness in her gaze, and, for reasons he didn't name, set the phone down. Claire dimmed the lights until the room glowed amber. The glare of screens softened into shadows. She handed him the warm mug. The tea smelled faintly of apple and hay, its surface trembling in his hand. He raised it to his lips reluctantly, but the warmth spread down his chest, easing the tightness he carried like armor. At 10:25, she sat across from him. "We'll try the 4-7-8 breathing," she said. "Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 7, exhale for 8. It slows the body." He arched a brow. "Sounds like nonsense. Try it anyway." They began together. Inhale, hold, exhale. The first round made him restless, his shoulders twitching as if fighting restraint. But by the third, his pulse had steadied. The white noise machine's waves blended with the sound of their breaths. He found himself leaning back against the sofa, eyes half closed. When 10:30 arrived, Claire pointed to the clock. Bed. He hesitated. His hand drifted toward the phone, a reflex as ingrained as breathing. But she shook her head. Not tonight. Reluctantly, he left it on the desk, in the bedroom. She drew the curtains to block the city glare. The quilt was smooth, the sheets cool. He lay down stiffly, unused to surrendering this hour. His body braced for another battle with the ceiling. But then he heard it again, the sound of waves, steady, endless. He let his chest rise and fall to match them. Minutes blurred. His mind resisted at first, replaying numbers, rehearsing strategies, yet slowly. The rhythm of his own breathing dulled the edges. His hand twitched once, reaching for a phone that wasn't there. And then, unexpectedly, his thoughts dissolved. Sleep came, not the shallow dozing he knew too well, but something deeper. It pulled him under, gentle and firm. He dreamed of nothing. When he opened his eyes, the room was dark, the clock reading 1:30. 3 full hours had passed. He stared at the red digits in disbelief. His body felt heavier, muscles loose, the ache in his temples gone. He had not known such rest since his 20s. He sat up, half afraid it would vanish like mist. In the next room, the soft scratch of pen on paper told him Claire was still awake, making notes in her planner. He padded to the doorway. She looked up, startled, a pencil between her fingers. "You slept," she said quietly. "For 3 hours," he admitted. The words felt both fragile and monumental. A small smile curved her lips. That's a start. He wanted to argue, to downplay it, to insist it meant nothing. But gratitude pressed too strongly against his chest. He only nodded, retreating before the moment could stretch. The next morning, Claire stood in his office with a red marker. On the wall calendar, she drew a line through the square for February 22nd. Beside it, she wrote, Night 2, Success. Graham entered, tie already knotted, jacket sharp. He paused at the sight of the red mark. "You're keeping score." "Of course," she said. "Progress matters." He shook his head, but a reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. The smallest thread of trust had been spun, fragile as glass, yet undeniably real. And for the first time, the thought crossed his mind. Maybe she wasn't just enforcing a schedule. Maybe she was giving him back pieces of life he had long surrendered. The invitation had arrived on heavy cream-colored paper, embossed with silver ink. A fundraising gala for the Boston Aquarium, hosted in the glass-walled hall that overlooked tanks of drifting jellyfish. Graham had declined such events before. They were full of handshakes, shallow promises, and cameras that caught every strained smile. But this time, the board insisted he attend. A CEO absent from society pages was a CEO rumored to be unwell. Claire helped him prepare, straightening the lapel of his black tuxedo. Adjusting the bow tie, he never seemed to get quite right. Her hands brushed his collar briefly, and he caught the faint scent of lavender from her lotion. She pulled back quickly, her professionalism like a shield. The aquarium hall shimmered in blue light. Jellyfish floated like ghosts in the tanks, their tendrils glowing faintly. A string quartet played near the entrance, their bows moving in slow unison. Waiters glided with trays of champagne, glasses clinking. Claire stayed close, clipboard tucked discreetly in her bag, though it was hardly needed here. She tracked the schedule in her head, kept watch on conversations, noted which philanthropists lingered near Graham. He moved among them with practiced grace, his smile controlled, his words precise. To the casual observer, he looked entirely at ease. Only she noticed the way his fingers brushed the edge of his glass too often, grounding himself. Hours passed in a blur of introductions and speeches. Graham gave a brief address, thanking donors, his voice resonant beneath the vaulted ceiling. When applause rose, Claire caught the flicker of weariness in his eyes. At last, it was over. The crowd began to disperse into the cold February night. Graham loosened his tie, shoulders sagging as they reached the car. Inside the warm leather interior, he leaned back and closed his eyes. For the first time in her memory, he fell asleep beside her. It was not the restless dozing she had seen on flights or in late-night rides from the airport. This was deeper. His jaw unclenched, his breathing slowed, his hands relaxed in his lap. She turned her head, watching him in the dim glow of passing streetlights. In repose, his face looked younger, almost vulnerable. She wanted to let him rest forever in that peace. The driver stopped at a red light. Claire glanced away, embarrassed by her own gaze. She reminded herself he was her employer, nothing more. Yet the sound of his breathing steadied something in her own chest. When they arrived at his building, the driver opened an umbrella, but the February drizzle blew sideways, stinging against their cheeks. The air was sharp, barely 34 degrees, and smelled faintly of salt from the harbor. As they hurried toward the door, Graham stirred fully awake, blinking against the cold. He reached out automatically, his hand brushing against hers as they shared the small space under the umbrella. The touch was not deliberate. It was the kind of accident that could happen to anyone. Two people navigating a slick sidewalk. One umbrella, hands shifting, but the jolt of warmth startled them both. Claire froze. His hand hovered just beside hers, their knuckles grazing. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. The rain blurred into background hiss. The city lights softened. She felt her own pulse quicken, an ache rising in her chest. He did not pull away at once. His eyes met hers in the shadows. Unreadable, but not cold. Something unspoken passed between them. Fragile, dangerous, undeniable. Then, with quiet precision, Graham withdrew his hand, slipping it into his coat pocket. Claire followed, adjusting her grip on the umbrella. They walked the final steps in silence, both aware of the line they had nearly crossed. At the entrance, the driver held the door. Graham murmured thanks, his voice steady again, as if nothing had happened. Claire stepped inside, removing her damp scarf, willing her cheeks to cool. In the elevator, the quiet was heavy. She focused on the glowing numbers above the doors. He stood beside her, hands folded, expression neutral. But the air between them vibrated with the memory of that fleeting contact. When the doors opened, he turned slightly toward her. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower than usual, for what she asked, almost too quickly, for tonight, for everything. She nodded, unable to trust her own words. The elevator closed behind her as she stepped out, leaving him alone with the silence. The door to his penthouse shut softly, but her presence lingered like the faint trace of rain on his skin. That night, as she wrote notes in her planner, Claire's hand paused over the page. She could still feel the ghost of his knuckles brushing hers, the heat that had startled her more than the winter air. She closed the notebook, pressing it shut. Some boundaries were meant to hold, and yet, when she turned off the lamp, the memory followed her into sleep. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished oak and coffee gone lukewarm. Graham sat at the head of the table, sleeves buttoned crisp, jaw set tight. Claire arranged notes at his side, her pen tapping once against the folder before she caught herself. The doors opened, heels clicked across the floor, steady, confident. Meredith Shaw walked in as if she had never left. Her hair gleamed, styled into soft waves that framed a face sharpened by ambition. A navy suit hugged her frame, pearl earrings catching the light. She carried no papers, no laptop, just presence, the kind that filled every corner of the room. Meredith will be joining us as a PR consultant, one of the directors announced. She'll help us manage the growing public interest in leadership changes. Claire's stomach tightened. She had heard the name in passing, always spoken with a mix of admiration and warning. Meredith, the former fiancé. Meredith, the strategist who could turn a rumor into a headline or erase one. Graham's expression barely shifted. Only the smallest flicker in his eyes betrayed recognition. He offered a nod, formal, detached. Claire pretended to keep writing, though her hand slowed across the page. As the meeting unfolded, Meredith's voice carried with authority. The company cannot afford distractions, personal stories, office gossip, even harmless speculation. These undermine investor confidence. We must protect the image of leadership. Her gaze lingered just long enough, on Claire. The words landed like stones. That night, whispers moved through the office. On the local business blog, a headline hinted at impropriety between the CEO and his assistant. Screenshots circulated on group chats, grainy photos of them leaving the aquarium gala. Claire kept her head down, but her ears caught the murmurs. Days later, something worse happened. Claire arrived at her desk to find her laptop missing. The IT team insisted they had no record of her checking it in. Hours later, a confidential bid document appeared online. Figures, proposals, details only a handful of people had access to. Reporters called within the hour. Phones rang with relentless urgency. Headlines sharpened Whitaker Group in turmoil. Breach of trust inside Boston's boardrooms. By noon, Claire's name was on everyone's lips, not loudly, not directly, but whispered, the way suspicions always are. She stood in the hallway outside the boardroom, folder pressed to her chest. Inside, voices rose, sharp with blame. Meredith's tone cut through, calm but damning. Leaks often come from the lowest point of access. An assistant, a contractor, someone overlooked. Claire's face burned. She wanted to storm in, to defend herself, but her feet refused. She waited, listening. When the doors opened, Graham emerged. His expression was carved from stone, eyes forward, lips sealed. He did not meet her gaze. For a moment, the air between them felt colder than the February rain outside. She searched his face for reassurance, for even the smallest sign of belief. Instead, silence. She turned back to her desk, sat down slowly, and opened a notebook with shaking hands. The page blurred as she wrote a line that made her heart ache. What if I don't belong here anymore? That evening, she packed her bag carefully, tucking her pen into its sleeve, folding her scarf across the top. The office lights dimmed, the hum of computers fading into stillness. She paused at the doorway, looked once at Graham's closed office, then left, without a word. The city air bit at her cheeks. Her thoughts swirled louder than traffic. She had given her steadiness, her patience, her quiet hours of care. Now she was a convenient suspect, her name tangled in whispers she could not fight. As she walked toward the train, Claire thought of Harbor Point, of salt air and stormy nights where life had felt simpler. A part of her longed to vanish back there, away from suspicion, away from boardrooms filled with half-truths. She had not decided yet, but the idea of leaving had already taken root. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday, folded in an envelope that smelled faintly of sea air and paper kept too long in a drawer. Claire found it tucked among bills and advertisements, her name written in neat black ink. She carried it to her small apartment's kitchen table, placed her hand over the seal, and waited before opening. Something in her chest told her this letter might shift the ground beneath her feet. Inside was an invitation. A 3-month position at a community project in Bar Harbor, an arts and culture initiative meant to revive the town square, bring local shops back to life, and create a space for young people to gather. The stipend was modest, but enough. More than enough for rent and groceries in Maine. And more than that, it meant home. She set the paper down and stared at it. Her father's health had been wavering. The calls from her sister always ended with, "He won't say it, but he's tired. He misses having family close." Claire thought of the creak of the old screen door, the way her father leaned on it while watching the tide come in, his eyes squinting against the wind. Boston felt very far away in that moment. She brewed tea, chamomile with honey, and sat by the window. Outside, the city's clamor carried up from the street horns, footsteps, the hum of buses. None of it sounded like home. She closed her eyes, and in memory she heard the sea, waves crashing against rocks, gulls crying above, the kind of sounds that sank into your bones if you grew up by the water. The job at Whitaker Group had given her a salary, stability, even a strange kind of importance. But lately it had also given her whispers, suspicion, and nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was being foolish to stay. Her fingers traced the edge of the letter again. She imagined mornings walking down Main Street in Bar Harbor, salt air thick in her lungs, stopping at the bakery where she once worked summers. She imagined evenings with her father at the kitchen table, eating chowder with oyster crackers, talking about the old days. The choice was not simple. Boston offered prestige, a front-row seat to power, and a proximity to Graham that both steadied and unsettled her. But Boston also carried shadows now, cast by Meredith's presence, by boardroom suspicions, by the silence Graham had not broken when her name was on every whisper. Maine offered quiet, a return to roots. A place where her name was not tangled in rumors, but belonged to familiar streets and neighbors who remembered her as a child, chasing kites on the beach. That night, she walked to the harbor, the nearest she could get to the sea without leaving the city. The air was raw, damp with late winter chill. She stood at the railing, the water dark and restless below, and let the wind tangle her hair. Her heart ached with longing she could not fully name. She thought of the storms that had trapped her in Harbor Point Inn, of how that night, strange and inconvenient, had given her the first glimpse of something unexpected. Graham asleep at last, her presence the only variable. She thought of his silence in the boardroom, and how that had cut deeper than any headline. A gull swooped low over the water, its cry sharp, echoing. She closed her eyes and whispered to the sea, as if it could carry her words back home. "I want to live, not just exist." The waves roared back in answer, indifferent and eternal. She pressed the letter flat against her chest, the paper warmed by her body, then folded it carefully into her wallet. She had not said yes. She had not said no. But the choice lived now inside her, like a tide pulling stronger each day. When she walked home, the streets of Boston felt colder, as though they already knew she was halfway gone. Snow fell in soft, steady silence, pressing against the glass walls of the rooftop greenhouse. From the street below, the structure looked like a lantern glowing faintly in the Boston night. Claire followed Graham up the narrow stairwell, her scarf still looped around her neck, her breath rising in pale clouds. When he unlocked the heavy glass door, a rush of warm, damp air spilled out. The scent of soil, mint, and faint citrus wrapped around her. Inside, rows of potted herbs lined the tables. Basil, rosemary, thyme. Above, small lamps glowed amber, casting light over green leaves and drops of condensation. "This is where I come when the city feels too sharp," Graham said quietly. His voice sounded different here, less clipped, less practiced, almost human in its hesitancy. Claire ran her fingers across the soft leaves of a mint plant, the coolness lingering on her fingertips. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and it was. Not because it was perfect, but because it was unexpected, a sanctuary carved out of steel and glass. They walked slowly between the rows. The snow pressed harder outside, blurring the city skyline. For a moment, Claire forgot the office, the rumors, the sharp stares in the boardroom. Here, it was only plants, warmth, and the man beside her. Graham stopped near a wooden bench tucked against the far wall. His hands rested on the back of it, knuckles pale. He took a long breath. "There's something I need to tell you." She turned, heart rising. His eyes were fixed not on her, but on the condensation sliding down the glass. "The reason I don't sleep," he began, voice low, "isn't just work. It's the water." She waited, letting the silence hold. "Years ago, there was an accident, a boat trip off the coast. It was supposed to be simple. A storm rolled in fast." His voice cracked slightly. He steadied it. "I nearly drowned. I remember the cold, the weight, the silence under the waves. Since then, whenever I close my eyes, it's like I'm back there, fighting to breathe." Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to reach for him, but she held still. She knew the fragility of confessions like this. They needed space. He pressed a hand against the glass wall. "That night at Harbor Point Inn, I don't know why, but for the first time in years, I slept. Because you were there. Your breathing, your presence. It anchored me." Her eyes stung. Not from pity, but from the rawness of his honesty. He was a man carved of discipline and steel, yet here he was, admitting the softest truth. "I thought it was an accident," he said. "One night, nothing more. But it wasn't. Every time since, when you're near, I sleep. It terrifies me how much I need that." She stepped closer, her boots quiet on the wooden floor. The warmth of the greenhouse wrapped around them, but the space between their bodies was charged with something colder, sharper, fear, desire, truth. "Graham," she whispered, finally letting his name fall with gentleness. "Needing someone doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." His eyes met hers then, clear and searching. For once, he did not shield them. A stillness spread through the room, deeper than silence. Claire felt the rapid thrum of her own heart, the tremor in her hands. She had told herself she would never cross this line. Yet here, surrounded by the scent of mint and damp earth, the line blurred until it was gone. He moved first, slowly, as if afraid to startle her. His hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed against her cheek. The warmth of his palm contrasted with the chill that had clung to her skin from outside. She leaned into it without meaning to, her breath catching. Their foreheads nearly touched. She felt the whisper of his breath, uneven, searching. Then, at last, his lips met hers. The kiss was not polished, not rehearsed like his speeches. It was unsteady, trembling at first, like both were afraid it might break them. But beneath the hesitation was something solid, certain, a truth they had both carried quietly until now. Claire's hands rose, one resting lightly against his chest. She felt the quick rhythm of his heartbeat, not steady as usual, but alive, racing. His other hand moved to her shoulder, holding her as if he feared the world might tilt. When they finally drew apart, the silence filled again. But it was different, not empty, but full of everything unsaid. Her lips tingled, her breath shallow. She wanted to speak, to name what had just begun, but words felt too fragile. Instead, she let her eyes tell him, "I feel it too." For a moment, the weight he always carried seemed lighter. He almost smiled, not the polished smile of boardrooms, but something softer. Yet beneath the warmth, both knew reality waited. The company, the whispers, Meredith, all the things that could unravel them. Claire looked away, to the snow pressing against the glass, blurring the city lights. Happiness pressed in, but so did worry. The kiss had opened a door, but doors led to unknown places. She reached for his hand briefly, squeezed once, then let go. "Tomorrow," she whispered, half promise, half prayer. Snow tapped against the glass like a clock ticking down. The storm did not begin with thunder. It began with an email, anonymous. No sender's name. Only a generic account created days earlier. But its timing was deliberate. The message landed in inboxes across the board just after the morning market opened. When every eye was sharp and every hand jittered over the stock ticker, the subject line was simple: evidence of fraud inside Whitaker Group. Claire sat at her desk, sorting through contracts. When the whispers began, first one phone buzzing, then two, then the sharp sound of chairs scraping in the corridor. A junior associate passed her door with wide eyes, clutching a printout. Minutes later, she was summoned upstairs. The boardroom was colder than usual, as if the air conditioning had been set to cut. Screens glowed with spreadsheets and attachments from the email. There, on the wall, projected for all to see, were invoices numbers that didn't add up, payments routed through a shell company with her name faintly linked in the chain. Victor Whitaker leaned forward, his tie a little too perfect. "This pattern is troubling. Funds moved offshore, receipts falsified." "And whose password approved the access?" He let the silence hang. "Claire Bennett's." Her stomach dropped. "That's impossible," she said, voice steady but low. I would never. Meredith's voice cut in, calm yet loud enough to carry. "We must be transparent. The press already has wind of this. The only way to reassure investors is to act swiftly, decisively." Her gaze flicked toward Claire, just long enough to sting. Reporters had gathered outside already, cameras waiting like vultures. Words like embezzlement and internal mole flew across the screens of financial networks. Graham sat silent at the head of the table. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark. She searched his face for defense, for trust, for the man who had kissed her under the greenhouse lights. Instead, there was only stone. The chairman cleared his throat. "To protect shareholder value, the board recommends a temporary suspension of Ms. Bennett until the investigation clears her name or proves otherwise." Claire felt every gaze land heavy on her shoulders. She looked to Graham one last time. His lips parted as if to speak, then pressed shut again. His silence was the verdict. She gathered her folder with trembling hands, stood slowly, and walked out. The door closed behind her with a dull thud that echoed down the corridor. Outside, rain had begun, thin needles falling through a gray Boston sky. She stepped into it without an umbrella. The drops clung to her coat, ran down her hair, blurred her vision until she could no longer tell what was water and what was tears. On the sidewalk, people hurried past with collars up and bags pressed to their sides. To them, she was only another woman caught in the weather. They did not know her name was being broadcast on business channels, her face linked to betrayal she had never committed. Her heels clicked against wet pavement, slower and slower until she stopped altogether beneath the awning of a coffee shop. Through the glass she saw warmth, steam, laughter. For a moment, she wanted to step inside, to disappear into ordinary life where no one knew her story, but her legs would not move. She pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolled past missed calls, past headlines, and stopped on a single photograph. The ocean, taken months ago on a quick visit home, the horizon endless, the water fierce yet familiar. Maine. Her heart tightened. That letter still waited in her wallet, folded and silent. 3 months of work in Bar Harbor, 3 months of family, of salt air, of something other than suspicion. She closed her eyes, letting the rain press against her skin. Boston felt colder now, colder than any winter storm. For the first time, she let herself wonder if she belonged somewhere else entirely. The office felt different once she was gone. For days, Graham moved through meetings like a man half present, his words measured, his face unreadable. But every night, when the clock struck 10:30, the calendar mocked him with red ink. Without her there to enforce it, the ritual collapsed. The silence of his penthouse pressed harder. sleep slipping through his fingers again. Claire, meanwhile, found herself unwilling to vanish quietly, alone in her apartment. She replayed the accusations until anger outweighed humiliation. She had not leaked anything. She had not betrayed him. If she walked away without proof, the lie would remain. So she called Daniel, an IT engineer she trusted, over coffee in a quiet corner of a Back Bay diner. They spread files across the table. The email didn't just appear, Daniel said. It was sent from somewhere. And people are careless when they think they're clever. For nights, they traced digital threads, IP addresses, login histories, each breadcrumb leading closer to a familiar name. At last, the trail ended at a townhouse registered to Victor Whitaker. Claire's pulse raced. It wasn't just suspicion now, it was proof. She met Graham privately, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside were the logs, the forged invoices, the financial trail that curved neatly back to his cousin. His eyes scanned the pages, jaw tightening, hands curling at the edges. "You're sure?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "It's all here." He framed me to cover his own shell accounts, offshore, through a company he controls. For the first time in weeks, their eyes met without walls between them. His voice dropped further. "You shouldn't have had to fight this alone." She didn't answer. The silence was enough. The next day, Graham called an emergency board session. The air in the room buzzed with unease. Meredith sat tall, pen poised like a weapon. Victor lounged with feigned ease, but his tie was knotted too tight, his smile a fraction too sharp. Graham laid the documents on the table one by one. The anonymous email that implicated Claire Bennett did not originate outside. It came from Victor's residence. The invoices were falsified. The funds moved through his shell corporation. The directors shifted, whispering. Meredith's pen stilled. Victor's face paled, then flushed red. "This is a smear," he spat. "You're protecting your assistant. The evidence is conclusive." Graham interrupted. His voice carried no tremor, only steel. "You endangered this company. You betrayed the board. You are finished here." The vote was swift. Victor was removed, escorted from the room with his protests echoing down the hall. For a moment, victory hung heavy in the air. Claire's name was cleared. The truth had spoken. But in the quiet after, she rose slowly from her chair. "This doesn't erase the damage," she said softly. "The press won't care about footnotes or follow-ups. My name is tied to scandal now. If I stay, the company keeps bleeding. If I go, you can start again." Claire. His voice broke against the single syllable. She shook her head. "You know it's true. The shareholders won't rest until I'm gone. And you can't fight every battle at once." The room faded around them, the chatter of directors distant. For a heartbeat. It was only the two of them, standing on opposite shores. Her resignation was written in plain black ink, but the weight of it pressed like stone. She left it on the table, her signature steady, though her hand trembled as she let go. That evening, she packed quietly. No grand farewell, no lingering in the office where she had spent years. She folded her scarves, slid her planner into her bag, and zipped it shut. Graham appeared at her door just as she lifted her suitcase. His face was drawn, the sharp lines softened by something like grief. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Yes, I do." Rain streaked the windows, soft and steady. The city glowed through it, blurred lights against a dark sky. She reached for his hand, held it for one brief moment, memorizing the warmth, the strength. Then she let go. At the bus terminal, the night air was heavy with exhaust and drizzle. She boarded quietly, choosing a seat near the window. As the engine rumbled to life, she looked out once more at Boston, the skyline she had served, the man she had come to love, the life she was leaving behind. In the glass, her own reflection stared back, eyes tired, but certain. The bus pulled into the dark, carrying her north, toward the coast. The wind off the Maine coast carried the smell of salt and wood smoke as Harbor Point gathered for the opening of its new community center. Children tugged at parents' sleeves, Elders leaned on canes, and the whole town seemed drawn by the promise of something fresh, something built to last. Claire stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, though she hardly needed it. Volunteers had set out chairs, local musicians tuned their instruments, and laughter mingled with the sound of gulls overhead. Her father sat in the front row, wrapped in his old navy coat. His face was thinner than she remembered, his steps slower, but when he looked up at the sign, Seafarers Rest Community Hall, a rare smile lit his features. For the first time in months, pride straightened his shoulders. Claire's heart swelled. She had left Boston in the chill of scandal, but here she was home, surrounded by faces that carried no suspicion, only welcome. The mayor gave a brief speech, followed by the local pastor. Then, as the applause died down, a new figure stepped forward, tall, formal in a dark coat, his hair ruffled by the ocean breeze. Graham Whitaker. Gasps rustled through the crowd. Claire's breath caught. He had not called ahead, had not written. Yet here he was, standing in front of her neighbors, holding a folder in his hands. "I come not only as a businessman," he said, voice steady against the wind, "but as someone who owes this town more than I can say. A storm brought me here once, and it changed the course of my life." His eyes flicked toward Claire briefly, then back to the crowd. "Today, I'm proud to announce the founding of the Seafarers Rest Fund, a grant dedicated to supporting Harbor Point's future, its fishermen, its youth, its families." Applause rose, genuine and surprised. Claire's father wiped at his eye with the corner of his glove. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed toward the hall for coffee and pie, Graham lingered by the edge of the field. Claire approached slowly, her pulse loud in her ears. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said softly. "I wasn't sure I could," he replied, "not until I was standing here." They walked together down the narrow path toward the lighthouse. Its white tower rose against the darkening sky, the beam beginning to sweep the horizon as dusk gathered. Snow clung to the rocks, and waves crashed below, throwing up mist that dampened their coats. At the base of the lighthouse, Graham turned to face her. His usual armor was gone. In its place was a man stripped of pretense, holding something small in his hand. "I've spent years measuring my worth in numbers," he said quietly. "But the only measure that matters now is whether I can build a life with you. Not contracts, not headlines, just us." He opened the small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band, unadorned except for the engraving on the inside. Claire tilted her head, squinting in the fading light. She read the numbers aloud, voice catching, 44.35, 68.21. "The coordinates," he said, "of the inn where the storm forced us together. The night I slept for the first time in years." Her breath trembled out. The wind whipped around them, carrying gull cries and the steady pulse of the sea. Claire pressed her hand to her mouth, tears hot against the cold air. She had imagined this moment in fragments, but never with such rawness, such weight. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking, then louder, steadier. "Yes." Graham slipped the ring onto her finger. His hands shook slightly, not from the cold, but from the enormity of it. They embraced, and for a moment the world shrank to only the two of them. Her cheek pressed against his chest. She could hear the thunder of his heart. His coat smelled faintly of cedar and salt. When they finally drew back, the lighthouse beams swept over them, a circle of light anchoring the promise they had just made. "I don't care what the board thinks. I don't care what headlines say," he murmured. "I care about you, about us." She smiled through tears, brushing wet hair from her face. "Then, let's find a place where none of that matters. A home that looks out on the bay." He nodded, his eyes shining with something uncharacteristically unguarded. "A home," he echoed. The waves crashed below, steady, eternal, as if sealing their vow. The cottage stood at the edge of the bay, its shingles weathered gray by salt wind, its windows wide to the horizon. Every morning, light spilled across the water and into their bedroom, touching the quilt they had chosen together. From that bed, they could hear the tide breathing against the rocks, steady as a heartbeat. On the dresser sat a framed photograph from their wedding, a simple ceremony, held on the bluff above Harbor Point. Claire's hair lifted by the wind, Graham's arm wrapped firmly around her, the lighthouse beam sweeping across them like a blessing. Another photo hung at Harbor Point Inn, donated by Mrs. Doyle herself, a reminder that storms can bring strangers together and rewrite their lives. Life here was smaller, but richer. Claire kept herbs in pots on the porch, mint and basil much like the ones that had once grown in the greenhouse. Graham stacked firewood in neat rows by the door, learning the rhythm of an axe splitting logs, a sound far different from the buzz of a trading floor. And every evening, without fail, the clock reached 10:30. The ritual never left them. Claire brewed chamomile tea in a chipped blue pot. Graham dimmed the lamps to golden pools of light. Screens went dark, replaced by the hush of waves played softly through the small speaker on the nightstand. They breathed together 4, 7, 8, until the rhythm pulled him gently under. He still marveled at it. Years of torment, nights pacing marble floors, vanished in the quiet presence of the woman beside him. Each morning, he woke rested, the miracle no less precious for being repeated. One Saturday, children gathered at the saltwater pool they had built near the docks. Graham had insisted on funding it. Claire had insisted it include lessons. Together, they taught local kids how to float, how to trust the water instead of fear it. Graham waded waist-deep, his dark hair slicked back, laughter escaping him when a boy splashed too hard. Claire sat on the edge with a whistle, calling encouragement. The echoes of joy filled the air, washing away the old shadows of drowning and silence. Graham no longer carried fear alone. He carried purpose. With her hand steady in his, evenings ended with simple meals, clam chowder, bread from the bakery, blueberries in summer. They sat on the porch as the sun sank low, gulls circling, the water blushing pink. Sometimes they spoke of the day. Sometimes they simply listened. Silence. Once Graham's enemy had become his friend. The cottage grew warm in winter, smoke curling from its chimney. Snow fell heavy, muffling the world. Claire lit candles. Graham stirred logs in the stove, and the house felt like a safe pocket against storms. And always, at 10:30, they returned to the bed, to the ritual that had once been forced, now chosen, to the comfort of knowing that rest was not weakness, but trust. There were no boardrooms here, no anonymous emails, no whispers that could bruise her name. There was only the steady breath beside him, the curve of her body beneath the quilt, the knowledge that the worst storms had passed. One night, as they lay in darkness, Graham whispered, "I used to think peace was impossible." Claire touched his hand, tracing the ring engraved with coordinates. "Sometimes peace is just a habit you choose to keep." He smiled against her hair. Habit, ritual, love, all the same in the end. The lighthouse beam swept the bay outside, its light circling, eternal, inside. Two souls rested, not in perfection, but in presence. And so, the story came full circle from a strange bed in a crowded inn, to the bed they now shared for life. Because peace, after all, is not a prize one earns. It is a rhythm, a promise kept each night at 10:30, together. And for you, listening now, where do you sleep most peacefully and who rests beside you when you do? Life has a way of testing us in storms we never expected. For Graham and Claire, it was not boardrooms, wealth, or polished success that gave them peace, but the simple act of resting side by side, sharing trust in the quiet hours of the night. The lesson is this: sometimes what we need most is not more control, not more achievement, but the courage to let someone in. Healing often begins not with grand victories, but with small rituals, a cup of tea before bed, a voice that calms, the steady presence of another heart beside ours. As we grow older, we learn that peace is not given by the world outside. It is built in the small, repeated acts of love we allow ourselves to receive, and often it is born from the very storms we thought might break us. So, the next time life feels unsteady, remember, rest is not weakness, And leaning on another is not failure. It is in our shared humanity and laughter, in forgiveness, in simple presence that we find the strength to sleep in peace. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and joining this journey through storms, love, and peace. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need a little light today. And don't forget to subscribe to Shining Stories for more heartfelt tales. Your support means the world, and together, we can keep bringing stories that inspire, comfort, and remind us all of the beauty in life.